morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Global Town Hall, where today we will discuss the message from grassroots organizations and civil societies to G20 leaders. This session is aptly named Dear G20 Leaders, Hopes and Aspirations from the Grassroots. And to listen to these questions and comments, we have the honor to have with us Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, Erlangga Hartarto. We know that he is at the forefront of Indonesia's efforts to chair the G20, and he will be taking questions from you. Welcome, Minister Erlangga. And
good morning.
Good morning,
Ambassador Pak Dino.
Thank you for being here. Maybe before I take questions from the discussions, is there anything that you can update us on the G20 preparation? That will be in Bali in mid-November.
Yeah, thank you for this momentous opportunities doing this town hall. And I think Indonesia lead the G20 at the challenging time. That's the challenge is never happened in our 100 years of humankind history, whereby we are in the midst of the COVID-19, as well as there is a challenge of geopolitical, what we call a perfect storm, where COVID, Ukraine geopolitics, and then climate change, increase of the commodity price, as well as cost of living. And other countries quite lucky that they skip this year, as Indonesia to move forward. But Indonesia is optimistic that under the current situations, the result of G20 will be optimum. Our target, of course, deliverables should be better than the previous G20.
Yes, well, I'm really glad that you are optimistic, because we cannot be pessimistic in dealing with what problems.
Exactly.
So I hope that optimism is infectious to the rest of the G20. I'd like to take some questions from our friends from the grassroots from other parts of the world. The first question is from Gurjit Singh, who is from Rising Asia. Gurjit, Mr. Gurjit.
Thank you. Thank you, Dino. And thank you, Honorable Minister. I must say that we admire Indonesia for its leadership of the G20 in these challenging times. I believe that this is the time for the world to remain multipolar and not be bipolarized. There are a lot of pressures on the G20. Now, is this a good time for the global South countries within the G20 to do more, to implement the SDGs, to make sure that the future of this planet is safer? We have always been dependent on what the G7 does, what China will do. But don't you think it's time that the global South countries do something? As you know, India, Brazil, and South Africa, who will succeed Indonesia as chair of the G20, have their own trilateral summit, which will take place in Bali. We would like to know how Indonesia proposes to push the agenda of the Global South so that others cannot derail. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I was a friend with your minister, Piyush Gupta, Piyush Goyal, who was a Sherpa in India. And I think Indonesia organized the G20 differently. We invite as an attendee the representative of African Union, as well as the island, the archipelagic nations. So this bring the flavor of G20 in different way than the previous G20. And then Indonesia concentrate on 4 focus or issues. One is about transformation of healthcare, in which Indonesia is able to push through the agenda for financial intermediary fund that is committed around 1.4 billion Second is on the transformation of digital, in which transformation digital, there is an issue of inclusiveness in developing the digital economy. The third is transition energy that is comply with SDGs and Paris Agreement, in which we introduce what we call energy transition mechanisms, which we move forward from fossil-based fuel to renewable energy. The third is we are talking about the food security, and the food security also is becoming one of the important topic for Indonesia leadership. And food security is a challenge for the global market. So those four pillars was accepted by most of the members, regardless from which grouping they are, emerging countries, G7, and also outside of the G7.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ambassador Gurjit from New Delhi. I now turn to Jovan Jovanovic, former member of Serbian Parliament from Serbia. Please, Jovan.
Thank you. It's an honor to be today with you and to have this opportunity. So I thank both to Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and to the Minister for this opportunity. As we all witnessed, the war in Ukraine with its global negative consequences casts shadow on everything, including the upcoming G20 summit. Having in mind the increasing global divisions and tensions, Indonesia should be congratulated for its efforts in bridging the widening gaps and ensuring that the G20 process remains intact and effective this year. So these efforts are highly appreciated. At the same time, the negative impact of Russia's aggression on Ukraine, particularly a global energy crisis that it triggered, starkly demonstrated that we cannot rely on fossil fuels anymore. Therefore, is it the right time to advance our efforts and accelerate the shift towards renewable energy? Since Indonesia has been championing the sustainable energy transition agenda during its G20 presidency, and the minister already mentioned this third pillar, I would appreciate if you could update us and give us more information about both Indonesia's and the G20's wider ambition regarding this crucial pillar. Thank you.
I think for Indonesia on the energy transmission mechanism, we have a concept that we call a Bali Compact, in which including the mechanism of financing, how to retire the coal power plant, as well as develop the renewable energy. And ADB has been working to work the models. The second models that we have is energy transmission, in which the developer of the renewable energy retired or phasing out their coal power plant, but the government state-owned company compensate with a new contract for renewable energy. So this has been shown in the projects. Hopefully in the due time, the memorandum of understanding can be signed. This is a big project of hydropower in North Kalimantan, which has a 5 cascade of power, in which the total is 12 gigawatt projects, and now under developer and Sumitomo, as well as we would put this into one of the program under US initiative of PGII. So we put most of deliverables of the projects for countries to decide. The difference between Indonesia G20s and previous G20s, we have concentrated on deliverables, in which deliverables will be put in one basket as an attachment to the G20 communique. Then this is a project that endorsed by at least 3 countries. So, so we have a list of deliverables from each country to show that we are committed not only on the narrative, but also the action plan. And some of the renewable energy, including development of geothermals, including the compact of nuclear energy, that is 77 megawatt. So there are quite a long list, including co-firing of coal fire as a transition with the ammonia development. There is also proposal for building green ammonia as well as green hydrogen, which is hydrogen will be the future of the next energy.
Thank you, Mr. Jovan. The third discussion is from Elisa Shafika from a NGO called Malaysian Youth Diplomacy. She's calling us from Kuala Lumpur. Elisa?
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me very well. First and foremost, thank you very much for FPCI for inviting me to represent youth, especially from Southeast Asia, and what are our aspirations, especially with the presidency of Indonesia in G20. I think I would like to lay out some of our aspirations. Basically, we think development is truly important. Without much development, I think a lot of things can't be very prosper. Especially for youth, we are the receiver, we are the beneficiary, and we are the ones who are going to lead the country at the end of the day. So it's truly inspiring on how to see the presidency have been for Indonesia, and we truly hope it will end with a very fruitful outcome, especially in the upcoming summit. So in this respect, I would like to know how does Indonesia position themselves on issues related with G20 and ASEAN relations, especially focusing on the youth engagement? Perhaps this form of enlightenment can be truly inspiring for most of the audience and people like me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have Y20 engagement group. So the Youth 20, the Think 20, and I think the Youth 20 discuss of many issues, and the Youth 20 already come up with the communique. So the communique of Youth 20 is becoming an input for the leaders' declaration. One of their recommendation that is important is the inclusiveness of transformation of digital economy. So here's Indonesia talking about the infrastructures within the global or within an ASEAN. We would like to have connectivity grid for digital, as well as connectivity grid for electric transmission. Because if you want to develop digital economy, you need infrastructures like data centers, and data centers are power hungry. So you need to develop renewable energy. So we have a program like in North Kalimantan that we will build 12 gigawatt of hydropower that is connected to Brunei, Malaysia, and maybe Philippines. So I think that's in order that data center can be brought. And the interconnectivity, if you want to watch Netflix or any economy, you don't want disruption in data. So that's the role of data centers. And I just coming back from Nongsa, Batam, in which Indonesia make a special economic zone for data centers. And it has launched 1 year ago, little bit more than a year, but it has a track of data center globally, almost 200 megawatt. So it shows that inclusiveness has to have infrastructures, and Indonesia is ready to make connection within ASEAN as well as with regional hub to the global market.
Okay. Thank you, Elisa. I want to ask one question before we end this conversation. The Fed in the US announced that they are raising the rates by 0.75 basis point. And I think this is one of the biggest economic news today. I'm just wondering how you think the G20 will respond to this, and do you think there will be concern about more and more capital leaving, for example, Southeast Asian countries or emerging economies back to the US? Is this going to be an issue, you think?
Yeah, one of the challenges is that when US raise interest rate, of course, we are looking into the capital flight. But if the country doesn't have an ecosystem that is at par with the US, so for Indonesia and ASEAN countries, there are no region in the global market that grew at more than 5%. So Indonesia is one of the few If we borrow the word from Managing Director IFF, Kristalina, Indonesia is a bright spot in the dark. So if we see the inflation has been dropped from 5.9 last month to 5.7, and while US still 8.2%, and the growth has been above 5% in the last 3 months. And I hope that Monday will be announced the growth of Indonesia, and I'm optimistic on the third quarter the growth can be 4.4 to 5.6 or even higher. So it means that Indonesia at a different situation than others. We can also see in the PMI that is above 51%. So the industry is optimistic. The consumer is more than 130. They are confident. Our export in the 9 months is 40 billion. So toward the end of the year will be 60 billion. So the fundamental of Indonesia is strong. Next year our budget deficit is less than 3%, and our debt is less than 60%. So Indonesia is among countries that is fundamental, is very strong. On top of that, ASEAN next week will be grow around 5%. And then India expected to recover at 6%. And China, of course, we will see how but they cannot afford not to have growth. So at least 4%. So at least the Indo-Pacific region will be still positive next year.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Coordinating Minister Erlangga, for your frank answers, and we wish you all the best for the G20 summit in Bali.
Right.
And we have heard from chair of the G20, Indonesia, which is a developing country and country from the global south. And now we will turn to a G20 leader response from the developed countries from the north, although coming from down under, which is Minister Patrick Gorman, who is assisting Prime Minister Albanese of Australia on the G20. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Ambassador Pak Dino.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I have to jump in from the studio next door, and I want to welcome everybody here and thank you, Minister Patrick Gorman, who's the Assistant Minister for Prime Minister Albanese, who will be in Bali for the G20 summit. Maybe I'll begin before taking questions from other discussions to ask Minister Patrick Gorman, what are your hopes and hope to achieve at the G20 summit in Bali from Australia's perspective here? Minister? Am I still off? Okay, can you hear me? Yes, Minister, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'm still off here, yeah. Sorry, there's some technical difficulty. Minister, if you can hear me, please nod. The minister still cannot hear me? Hello? Minister, can you hear me? Yes, Minister, can you hear me? Hello? He cannot hear me still. Yes, you can hear me now. Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties. And I want to thank everybody for joining, and Minister Patrick Gorman, who is Assistant Minister to Prime Minister Albanese, who will be attending the G20 summit in Bali in mid-November. Maybe I should ask Minister Patrick Gorman, from Australia's perspective, what do you hope the G20 summit will achieve come Bali in mid-November?
Well, Australia and Prime Minister Albanese are very excited that Indonesia is hosting this incredibly important meeting of the G20. Of course, Australia was one of the leading voices under Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who I know was joining the Global Town Hall earlier today. We're one of those leading voices for the establishment of the G20, because we knew that countries like Indonesia, Australia have so much to contribute to the solutions that we need, that we can only achieve when we work together. And it was just a few weeks after Prime Minister Albanese was elected as Prime Minister here in Australia in May that he made a very strong declaration that he, as Prime Minister, would attend the G20 to be held in Bali. I know he's really looking forward to it, and there's been a lot of work from Australian officials, and of course, I do want to commend also the work of Indonesian officials. Hosting these events is no easy feat, but it's really exciting that it's coming to our part of the world in the Indo-Pacific, and we really do hope that it is as successful as the world indeed needs it to be.
Thank you. I think we can all agree that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the G20 will never be the same again. So it's going to be interesting how the discussions will turn out. I'm going to allow Jamie Drummond, founder of Sharing Strategies, who's been having a lot of work to give inputs to the G20 to frame our discussions today. And then after that, I will ask Professor Sheikh Munir Kasru, who's the co-chair of G20 Task Force on SDG and Digital Transformation, also chairman of IPAC Asia Pacific. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Very good. And great to it's early here in London. So apologies if I mumble at all. Tell me. So I know I've got to be brief. During the course of the G20 in Bali, I think the world's population hits 8 billion people. 8 billion people alive with population projections. And the G20, of course, is an innovation and improvement over the G7. It represents 4.8 billion of those 8 billion. But still, there's 3.2 billion people who are not represented by a country who's in the G20. So one of the key things I think we have to think about is how those other 3.2 billion are heard. The G20 is a very important global forum for discussion in these very difficult times. But how those 3.2 billion, and in particular, is the voices of Africa and Africa's youth that are most unheard currently in the way the G20 is set up. And the kinds of things we're hearing from them, which is very similar to young people the world over, is about the importance of good green jobs and access to education and opportunity. And those are obviously important issues on the agenda for the G20. It's really commendable that last year's G20 under Italy commissioned the Capital Adequacy Framework report on the multilateral development banks. That's a terrible collection of acronyms, but very important nonetheless. How can something so boring be so important? But the capital adequacy of the big global public banks, recommendations from a group of experts commissioned by the G20 has now made its recommendations about how the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, et cetera, all the big regional and global public banks can use their capital far more effectively to invest in the needs of the world's youth, and including and especially Africa's youth, who are a booming aspirational population. And so we could leverage literally trillions of dollars more per annum. It's great news, really great news, that Indonesia is very committed to advancing the recommendations of the Capital Adequacy Framework report. And we understand India in her G20 next year will continue that, strongly require and demand, I think, from the grassroots, is that those recommendations be followed through. So we have additional investments for education, for health, for agriculture and food security, and above all, for things like the energy transitions. Yeah. So it is what a lot of people are asking for, particularly we're going to hear that from Egypt and from people in Sharm el-Sheikh over the next couple of weeks. But let's make sure that the 3.2 billion who are currently missing are really heard better in forums like the G20. And let's make sure opportunities like the Capital Adequacy Framework's recommendations about how to make the multilateral banks more efficient in their use of capital and get the investments into the hands of local leaders and young people. I think that would be a great thing for Indonesia to advance with the support and partnership of Australia and others.
Thank you, Jamie, for those very important suggestions. Now I turn to Professor Syed Munir Kasru.
Thank you so much. Respected ministers, today's moderator, fellow panelists, and those of our friends and colleagues joining from around the world. I think the Indonesian Minister for Economic Affairs, Hartarto made a very poignant reference that this year's G20 summit is happening under the unusual circumstances. And I would like to quickly touch base on three issues. If you look at the G20 motto of Indonesian presidents, recover stronger, recover together. When we say recover stronger, the ground reality is, even before the Ukraine war started, in the post-pandemic scenario, the development clock has switched backwards. Whatever achievement was happening in 25 years, now we have another additional 80 to 90 million people living in extreme poverty. Then we have soaring energy prices. We have global supply chain disruptions. We have inflationary pressures. We have more than 50% of the developing countries in severe debt crisis. So need for fund has gone up, but availability of fund has gone down. So that will be a key challenge for G20 leadership. And as very correctly alluded by my previous speakers, there's a great opportunity. Indonesia followed by India. Then we have Brazil and South Africa, 4 major developing economies. How Indonesia sets the tone for this critical development agenda. My second take would be, which Jamie had alluded already, youth. And I would like to add another dimension, the women. Even as we speak, 900 million women are outside the digital economy, outside the mobile banking services. And then we have 1.2 billion people in the age group of 15 to 25, and a significant portion not having internet connection. What would the leaders do? Because one of the 3 pillars of Indonesian priority has been digital economic transformation. And since I was leading the task force on both digital transformation, SDG, I had the opportunity to have a deep dive into these issues. The second is how to recover together when G20 has never been more fractured as before. We are all aware, in the wake of Ukraine war, there's a clear division. And we have seen in the ministerial rounds, there's a lot of difficulty in getting a joint communique issue. So that will be interesting to see how the leadership handles when all the leaders converge in Bali. And my third intake is more towards Honorable Minister Patrick Gorman. I mean, Australia hosted the summit 2014 in Brisbane, as you know. But after the taking over of power by the new government, we are a little curious to see how Australia changes its orientation, because the reality is Australia's ODA is 0.2%, as opposed to the 0.7% recommended globally, and 0.32%, which is the OECD standard. So what's Australia going to do about it? Then your Prime Minister made a commitment that Australia will become, quote unquote, the superpower of renewable energy. Now, Australia is in a unique position to drive technology innovation and energy transition, which is the third key pillar of Indonesian presidency. What role Australia would play in helping Indonesia drive forward the third pillar, energy transition, and added to that, technology innovation. With that opening remarks, I would rest, and we're very happy to come back at a later stage if need be. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, I would, because we are pressed for time, I'm going to invite the next 2 discussions so that Minister Patrick Gorman can have ample time to respond. I would like to call on Eloise Todd from Pandemic Action Network in Belgium. And then after that, Liang Shuang, the youth representative from Universidad del Sino Cartagena, Colombia. So Eloise Todd, please say your comments.
Thank you so much. I'm from the Pandemic Action Network, which is a group of over 300 organizations globally. We are fighting to curb COVID and prevent future pandemics. And we really need this point to not fall off the political agenda. Right now, this is needed more than ever. As we look towards the G20, we do want to thank the Indonesian government for the leadership on this point. there has been the foundation of the pandemic fund, and we urge the Indonesian government and all governments to not only pledge money to that fund. It's so vital that low and middle income countries have access to funds for pandemic prevention, preparedness and response when needed, but also those that have already given increase that ask. I wanted to echo also the points made by Jamie Drummond on the capital adequacy framework. There's some very exciting changes taking place in the multilateral development bank world, not only for climate, but they could also have a lot of resonance for pandemic preparedness and response. We need to invest now, mitigate against the possible consequences of pandemics like COVID. And we also need to change the game in terms of representation, which colleagues have also raised. When COVID struck 2 years ago, we didn't have a mechanism to convene leaders around the world. We are calling for a global health threats council, a mechanism whereby leaders, not just health ministers, but leaders convene, negotiate, understand how they're going to deal with pandemic countermeasures. We want to see a world in which clinics in Uganda have the same access to the same pandemic countermeasures, vaccines, tests, treatments as those in the USA. That's the aim. If you're watching this and you want to follow us, you want to help us, you want to be a part of Pandemic Action Network, the door is open. We cannot afford for the world to forget the lessons of COVID. We owe it to the people that lost their lives, and we owe it to the setbacks that were made on the SDGs. Everything is connected, whether you work on climate, anti-poverty, gender, health. We cannot afford to have the same crisis as we saw with COVID again. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Liang Shuang from Colombia.
Hello, I'm an exchange student from Cartagena University in Colombia. I'm very honored to be part of this conference because I'm a student. I'm aware of what G20 process look like as I'm not on the negotiation table. Can you explain to me and other young people like me across the world how the G20 aims to bring positive impacts? What I'm most worried about in the world is the inactive job market. Many university students like me are having trouble finding a job after graduation. How can G20 leaders provide a solution to this increasingly difficulty of job searching? What kind of response can all of you as policymakers make to stabilize the job market? That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick Gorman.
Thank you very much, Dino, and thank you to all of the contributors so far for some really insightful questions and things where, of course, what we all want to do is lift the ambition of what the G20 can achieve. And I think one of the things that I take from all of those comments is that there is great ambition for what this particular meeting and for what the G20, with some of the challenges that sit ahead of us from the unjustified war in Ukraine through to the climate crisis, through to challenges around intergenerational inequality, all of those challenges, and how we can make sure that we use these global forums to give everyone a brighter future. I'm going to share with you a comment that our Prime Minister Albanese, likes to say about Australia's position on some of our domestic policy challenges, but it also speaks to how we approach some of the challenges that have just been outlined and how we deal with them, which is this idea of no one held back, no one left behind. And when we say no one held back, no one left behind, we're talking about making sure that people have the tools to be able to enrich themselves, to open those doors of opportunity wherever you are in the world, but also to make sure that as we provide opportunity on the one hand, we are not forgetting about those who can't even grab those opportunities that may exist. If I go to some of the specific points, and I'll try and spend about 45 seconds on each. I think, Jamie, I share with you the concerns that there is no forum where every voice is equal. And we don't believe that the G20 is that. The G20 is those major economies recognizing that they have a very particular and special role of leadership. And that includes making sure that we help other countries where they may not be meeting sustainable development goals, where we know we have slipped backwards, making sure that we know that there is a special expectation on wealthy countries such as Australia to do our fair share in that circumstance. And if I think about the particular challenges with development in Africa, obviously I'm coming to you from Perth, Western Australia, where there is a huge connection with the economic development of Africa and African nations, particularly through our mining industry. And we see that particularly with some of those minerals and resources that we will need for that net zero world, there is huge opportunity for some of those good quality sustainable jobs, particularly for the next generation of people in African nations. If I go to Professor Sayed and what you said about official development assistance, I'm pleased to say that Australia is increasing our ambition. And of course, we call on all nations to continue to do what they can to help out, lend that hand of friendship and support. In our most recent budget, we had an additional $1 billion of investment for our region in the Pacific. We recognise that Australia has an important role to play there. And that's why we've continued to invest in that in particular. And when it comes to climate and energy, Australia for many years has been an energy exporter to the world. Originally with coal, more recently with large amounts of gas contributed into the world market. And we want to continue to be that energy exporter, but we recognise that it's actually those new clean energy opportunities. We mentioned hydrogen, we mentioned the ability to potentially also send direct current electricity through subsea cables. There's huge opportunity there, as well as embodied energy in advanced manufacturing. On the lessons of COVID, Eloise, I think you put it really well, that we must learn these lessons. And this is something that we know is on the G20 agenda, looking at how do we make sure that we have learnt the lessons of this pandemic, not just for the challenges that we continue to face with COVID around the world, but to learn the lessons for what comes next. What we know the experts are telling us is that there will be more pandemics and that the intervals between are likely to be shorter, not longer. So one of the things we're looking to do is to build a Centre for Disease Control here in Australia, which again is about contributing into that global research and practitioner world to make sure that we are as ready as possible. And indeed, I think the other thing that I just note in terms of the G20 agenda is that we are all experiencing, in large part, conversation will centre around energy, but everyone is still experiencing supply chain shocks, which is the other big challenge that has held people back as a result of COVID, and we want to continue that conversation. And Liang, on the question of youth and making sure that young people have opportunity, I think it's worth saying, particularly now, the G20 is something that we somewhat take for granted, but it's been around for sort of almost 15 years now. It was really founded with that in mind, that idea that you wanted to make sure that you didn't have a generation that misses out because of large economic shocks. It was born out of the crisis of the global financial crisis or the global recession of 2008, 2009. And it wasn't built, it wasn't expected that it would deal with the challenges of pandemics, an unjustified war, energy crunch, but in its heart, and I know that the Indonesian government, as the president of this G20, knows that we've got to make sure that the G20 delivers for the next generation. And I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you, Patrick. We'll take two more questions from Eva Recchi, Honorable Member of Mexican Global Network Korea Chapter, Mexico.
Hi, good day to everyone. Good night here in Mexico. It's an honor to be with all of you. And first of all, I want to say that I agree with all your comments. Saeed, Liang, Jamie, Dr. Dino, everyone. And starting from them, we now have a big situation that I wonder how the G20 is gonna look for it and look to solve it. Migration, massive migrations. We're starting to live them and to have a lot of situation, complications, problems, which are social, health, economic, and about human rights as well. How the G20 is gonna face this? Because now with this war at the Ukraine, with this major crisis of energetics in the north of Europe or Western Europe, we're not talking only of people coming from third countries or underdeveloped countries running away from them. We're talking about Europeans coming to better spots with energy, with food, with better climates, everything. So a massive immigration is going to be changing. It's going to be a huge, situation for everyone. How is the G20 facing this, and what are you looking for that? Because I guess that, as you said, Mr. Patrick, it's something, if we want to achieve a goal, we need to work together. But right now, it doesn't seem that we are doing that. Actually, it looks like we are blocking each other to avoid to have more people. But the reality is that people is running away to our countries. So that's my question for you. How the G20 is going to face this massive migration that now with the war is increasing even more?
Thank you for that question. And I think Eva is raising a very good point that the G20 should not belong only to G20 countries. The rest of the world should feel that they own G20. And of course, I would like to get Mr. Patrick Gorman's comment later. But before that, question from Marot Tulung from African Youth African Network from South Sudan. Marot, please. Marot?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I hope you can all hear me very well. So much of the issues that are being discussed at the G20 impact the African nations and other island and then the low-income countries so much. And we're very aware that these countries, the African nations, are the hardest hit by some of these crises that we have currently. The food crisis, the energy crisis, the financial crisis, and now also like the climate crisis that, for example, the floods that are in Sudan, in South Sudan, the drought that we have and the famine that we have in Somalia. So it will really be very interesting. And I think it's what all of us are in the discussion actually putting forward here. It will really be very interesting to see a response from the G20 that is also inclusive and put into action, like collective action that are urgent, and also put into considerations the participation and ownership of local communities and the hardest to reach grassroots. Because we are saying, let's collectively work together, but we ensure that the voices, regardless of where they are all represented at the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Minister Patrick Gorman, before you answer, we also have a message from Miss Universe, Harnas Kaur Sandhu, Miss Universe 2021 from India. Why don't we listen to what she has to say, and then you can respond later. And also I want to say thank you to Jessica from Australia, Damiola from Nigeria, Priyanshi from India, and Dr. Bonface Obari from Botswana for your comments in the chat group on the G20. We definitely hear your suggestions and is being read to the panels and being considered. Let's play a video from Miss Universe Harnas Kaur Sandhu.
Namaste, I'm Harnas Sandhu and I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today about critical issues affecting half the population of the world, women and girls. Over the last few years, the G20 has started to pay attention to gender issues and welcome the efforts of the previous presidencies in Saudi Arabia, Italy and the current Indonesian one, particularly through the W20 as one of the wider dimensions of G20 discussions. Going forward, however, more can be done and needs to be done, and I hope that this will stop being an adjacent issue and start being reflected in the core agenda items of the G20. The G20 comprises the 20 largest economies in the world, and I truly hope that they will step up their investments not only in obvious programs and issues affecting women and girls directly, but also in ensuring that all their discussions and deliberations are including gender perspective. By failing to include a gender dimension in the planning, financing, and adoption of common actions by the G20, there is a risk of abating out at the very least, inadvertently not tackling issues that continue to exclude women and girls. I'm here to provoke thinking on an issue that is inexplicably linked to gender inequality. And I would argue it is perhaps at the very genesis of it. Period poverty. I first learned about period poverty as a child from my mom, who was a gynecologist, and growing up, we talked freely about my period. I was never embarrassed or humiliated, but having my period was normal and natural. While traveling with my mom around India, that's where I learned that this was not the case for so many people. I learned that the stigma surrounding periods is still a huge barrier to women's empowerment and equality. Gender inequality intensifies when a girl gets her first period with the taboos and a list of do's and don'ts. These are impressionable and formative years for the girls, and she gets shaped by what she is told and what she experiences, and thus the inequality in her own mind and those around her begins. The more measurable effects are girls dropping out of the school, leading to loss in education and consequently lesser workforce participation as she grows up, leading further to the vicious cycle of the intensification of gender inequality in everything that lack of education means. Period poverty is defined as insufficient access to effective period products, educational tools, and proper sanitation facilities. Period poverty affects over 500 million people around the world, and the repercussions are vast. Personal and reproductive health are compromised. Mental well-being is negatively impacted, and in some cases, the overall experience is quite traumatic. Period poverty is pervasive around the world, even in developed countries like United States, where 1 in 5 experience period poverty each year. But the scale of the problem is greatest in global South countries. In India alone, the scale of the problem is massive, affecting some 50 million people each year. And I believe that the problem really starts with the fact that many people still not feel comfortable talking about periods, including people with periods and their close circles like parents, siblings, teachers, and the people that growing children look up to. And just not that, there is a lack of conversation around the issue in world-changing forums like the G20. These are many reasons that why I was a part of the launch of a new collective earlier this year, the Global Menstrual Equity Accelerator, and our campaign, Period for Change. In September at the 2022 Global Citizen Festival in New York City, Period for Change will fight stigma, influence policy, and secure resources needed to end period poverty. The collective will invite change makers in the space globally and help scale up their efforts. To tackle the problems, we need sustainable response by private industries, NGO products and commitments, and government distribution schemes, social enterprise, and implementations of far-reaching awareness and advocacy campaigns. We know that change is possible. In 2020, Scotland's period products bill was passed unanimously by Scottish lawmakers, representing a landmark victory for the global movement against period poverty. Women in Scotland now have a legal right to free menstrual products in all public facilities, including schools and universities, and we need more countries to lead change like Scotland did. I hope you will join me in supporting Period for Change campaign by working together, raising awareness, and increasing our advocacy efforts. We can create lasting change towards achieving menstrual equity and hence gender equity. Achieving our goals will require investments in awareness programs that targets the entire community. It will require increase in access to affordable and safe period products, and it will require safe and healthy waste management. And the most importantly, acknowledgement at global and country policy level forums that menstrual equity is essential to truly achieving gender equity. Gender issues should be included in the core discussions of the Ministers of Finance and Central Bank Governors, Ministers of Health, and most particularly, the deliberations of leaders. In all discussions, gender perspective should be factored in, and gendered approach to budgeting should be promoted internally and globally. In closing, I want to share my gratitude for the opportunity to share my perspective about a critical issue affecting women, girls, and all people who experience period around the world. I'm looking forward to the upcoming Indian presidency of the G20 in 2023, and it will be a tremendous opportunity to shine on a spotlight on the menstrual equity agenda as well as the critical issue of gender equity. Thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak to you all today. Shukriya.
Thank you, Harnas. And Minister Patrick Gorman, you have 6 minutes before we close this session to answer all these very important suggestions. Yeah. Minister.
Thank you very much, Dino. And what I might do is just address a few of those items that have been raised, from climate to gender equality to migration, and then I'll go to some closing remarks, and I'll do it all in one set. If I start with Hanaz, and firstly, thank you for opening up this conversation. Someone in a position such as yourself is often so much better than a politician or someone in a ministry leading these conversations. And when it comes to period poverty, I actually think it's really worth noting for people, wherever you might watch around the world, that even in Australia, we're not great at opening up this conversation. In recent times, we've seen states in Australia start to provide free menstrual products in our schools. That's been a really welcome step, but it's only happened in the last 12 months or so. And so if I think about the mindset that we have had here in Australia about some of these conversations that, as you rightly note, people are not comfortable about having, then it does affect our ability to engage in those broader policy discussions where we need to know that this is actually holding back because of completely unjustified embarrassment. It's holding back our workforce, it's holding back girls from participating fully in education, and there are really logical things we can do through our development programs and indeed through our education programs to make a real difference. And I might use an opportunity just to say a huge thank you to Global Citizen for the work that they do in opening up these conversations and engaging with a much broader part of our population. When it comes to migration, and Australia is a proud migrant nation, this is a challenge. Every nation has the right to determine how people come and settle in those countries, but at the same time, those rights come with obligations to make sure that we do our part, particularly if you're a well-off country, in terms of supporting UNHCR and other agencies and making sure that we do our bit in terms of humanitarian programs. And Australia is working through that at the moment. And I talk on climate very quickly, just to say, I think one of the things that I'm really proud Australia is doing is upping our ambition. We are a large nation. We have large emissions. We need to do our share to get to that global net zero by 2050. If I can say some more broad closing remarks, I'd firstly like to thank the foreign policy community of Indonesia for coordinating such a special event. I want to thank my friends, Michael Sheldrick, who I've known since we were teenagers here in Western Australia, and to Dr. Dino Djal for hosting such a fabulous session. This has been a conversation which really builds upon what we hope to get out of the G20. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Prime Minister was very determined to be one of the first world leaders to declare he was attending the G20 and to show his support for Indonesia's presidency. It means so much to us in this region, and I know it doesn't just mean something to Australia or Indonesia, but to our Pacific neighbours as well, where, again, making sure that those countries such as Australia and Indonesia, where we have those really close ties, where not every country has a seat at the table, but we recognise that we are there not just on behalf of our nation, but on behalf of our regions. And I think that's a really important thing to address some of the other really important issues that have been noted. And if I can close on this note, it is so important that the G20 is part of our democratic engagement. If I think about Australia and Indonesia in particular, both countries of strong democratic values, we need to continue, and Australia will always be a voice for democracy in the world. We recognise that democratic nations are successful nations, and that democracy plays such an important role in stabilising our world and ensuring that people, in particular young people, feel like they have a say and a stake in our collective future. And with that, thank you again for hosting this really important session.
Thank you very much, Minister Patrick Gorman, and thank you to all the panelists and discussants for your comments. You are very right, Minister Patrick Gorman, that there are a lot of hopes on the G20 as a forum where the problems of the world can feels that the world is going wrong direction at the moment, and we hope that the G20 can reverse that trend. So lots of luck and best wishes for you, for Australia, and for all the leaders at G20 as they try to set the world in the right direction again.
Indeed. Best of luck to all who attend the G20 in whichever capacity you may find yourself there.
Thank you.